song. All the people are gonna come, 'cause it's time for PeaCreaLive. With Dave and Arny.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to PeaCreaLive.
Welcome to PeaCreaLive, guys, with Dave and Arny. This is the show that we do most weekdays in order to bring a little bit of positivity in these strange times. And today we have a special guest to talk about compassion and shame. And David is going to introduce our guest.
Yes, thank you, Arnaud, and thank you, anybody who's watching. I'm very pleased, super excited to have Andy Bradley here on the show. Andy is the founder of frameworksforchange.co.uk. And as I know it, because Andy and I did a little work together some years ago, as I know it, this is a man who is trying to revolutionize what's going on in the healthcare industry, especially from the perspective of the carers and helping the carers get compassionate care themselves so they can deliver the most compassionate and effective care to those around them. And Andy, I'd love to hear if that's, still the way it goes for you. But also, Andy has a TEDx talk about compassion that you can go look up. It's a great talk, and really cool story about that TEDx talk, actually, maybe we'll get from Andy. And but he's doing amazing things, and we're here today to talk about shame and compassion. Andy, thank you so much for being on the show.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you both for holding the space. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the dialogue, and I'm wondering what the cool story is about the TED Talk.
Well, by the way, just if that mic, if you can just hold it up a little bit better, yeah. But the story I know about your TED Talk is that you had this whole thing prepared, and you were preparing it for a long time, and you actually had some anxiety about this TED Talk. What you're going to do, you're going to be on stage with all these people, but then something happened. And maybe now you know what I'm referring to, yeah? Yeah, so tell us how that went.
So I've been really privileged to be invited in to speak to lots of different audiences about kind of relational dynamics in healthcare and power and kindness and compassion. And systemically speaking, what tends to happen is that those that are giving the care get left out, and it's always about the end user, the patient, the resident, service user. So energetically, it's always about that person rather than the nurse or the healthcare assistant or the doctor. And we know there are very high levels of burnout and stress and shame. People make mistakes, it eats them up. So I've been beavering away on this kind of idea of closing the compassion gap for about 17 years now. Closing the compassion gap to make the world a kinder place with many other collaborators. And I've been really privileged to be trusted to speak to, various audiences about it. But there was something about the invitation to TED that was a different dynamic. It was something about the form that it takes, and that you're on, and you've got to jump straight in. You've just got that time. So, yeah, it was an interesting dynamic. I'll never forget. I was in a barbecue, and I got the email saying you've been invited to speak at TEDx, and I went, oh my God, I've been invited to speak at TEDx. And there was like 3 people at the barbecue that were total TEDster nuts. And they were like, wow, this is totally crazy. So there's something about the brand, the TED brand. So I basically asked 3 people that I really trust to kind of work with me on my script. And the whole thing, as you probably know, is ideas worth spreading. And I wanted to get down to 10 minutes. And so we worked it out. I was really happy with it. And my kind of coaches said, so the only thing that can go wrong now is that you depart from the script. And then the speaker was on before me, and I was really immersed in that, and I was just about to go on, and I just leant over to my dear partner Kirsty, who was one of my coaches. She's an educator and she's awesome. And I just said, Kirst, I just need you to know that I don't know what I'm going to say, but I do know that I'm going off script, and I'm sorry. And then the first words that came out of my mouth, I just kind of stood there, got present for a moment. And then what came out was, some of us are lucky enough at the beginning of our lives to be held and loved and to be held with compassion. And some of us at the end of our lives are lucky enough to be held as we part from this lifetime from our body and to be held with compassion. And then there's this big gap, and it's this gap that I'd like to speak to you about. And so that's what came out, was closing the compassion gap, and the rest of the talk is about that gap. And that's in a way why I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to hopefully kind of safely take the viewer in, and for the three of us to have a safe dialogue about shame, because it's shame. The research says that shame is the number one barrier to compassion, to the flow of compassion, and it's the one that really eats away at us. It's the one that causes the anxieties, the depressions, the stored up traumas, the suicides, the burnout. So I'm really happy to have an opportunity to bounce some ideas around and just kind of unpack that topic, really. What is the relationship between shame and compassion, and how, what I'm learning is how, when we invite them to meet each other directly, what then takes place.
So wait, so you went completely off script for your whole TED, or you just changed the intro? Or because that's crazy to me to hear that you prepared it with 3 coaches and then last minute you just switched to something else. How did it go?
Yeah, it was great. There were parts of the talk that I recognized myself giving, parts that I'd prepared, and other parts that became kind of flowed through, and it ended the way that I planned for it to end. And I landed the core practice, which is quiet mind, open heart. So that's what I teach. It's a very simple practice. It's basically around moment by moment, one can enter a state of compassion when one quietens one's mind and opens one's heart. It's called Here I Am. My mind is quiet, my heart is open. So the talk finishes with here we are, our minds are quiet, our hearts are open, and everyone's standing, and we're kind of standing for compassion at the end of the talk.
Wow, sounds great. Just want to remind everyone's watching that this is live. You're watching a live show, and you can ask your questions to Andy about compassion, about shame, about his work on healthcare. And now I'm sure that David has some question to kick off this show.
Yes, I do have a question. No, this is well, the first question is, very interesting to hear that shame, the research into this shows shame is a big blocker to compassion. I feel like that resonates with me. The times that I feel shameful for something in my life, and it usually comes up in like in the most intimate relationships, you know what I mean? That's like triggers are that deep shame stuff, and for me. And so, yeah, I find myself I get defensive in those moments, and the anger comes up, and it's harder for me to access the compassion. So that resonates with me. But I guess the first question that would be really interesting is, what is the shame? What is shame? In the first place, what this thing that we experience, like, what is it?
So one of the ways that I've come to understand the difference between, or what shame is to differentiate it with guilt. So my kind of embodied understanding in this moment is that guilt is I've done something wrong, and shame is I am wrong. So one of the definitions of shame is that it's a complex combination of emotional, physiological responses and imagery associated with the real or imagined rupture of relational ties. Put more simply, it's the fear of disruption to relational ties. So, building on what you were saying, David, around what was resonating within you as we begin with this inquiry, it is that deep part that's often unconscious that can be programmed in, wired in from a very young age. It could be that we didn't learn to play. It could be that we didn't feel safe as babies and toddlers and children, and that we store up a kind of feeling of wrongness within ourselves, and that we unconsciously then create a sort of relational pattern within ourselves and around ourselves, which, it's deep work. It's deep work to meet our shame with compassion. So, when we the tendency is to want to run from that wrong feeling, and so it's difficult for us to encounter. So the way I think about it and the way I sort of talk about it is we tend to put the shame in the basement. The shame and the fear and the trauma gets shoved down in the basement, and then the kind of ground floor of the house is kind of ordinary living, and then the kind of upstairs where the light comes in through the loft is where all the potential for integration is. So, the shame kind of resides in the sort of limbic system, and then the neocortex is where we've got that potential to integrate the shame. But then what I've learned is we can only really integrate the shame when we connect up with the heart and the gut. So it's a whole embodied affair. And then what I've learned beyond that is it's not my job to deal with my shame. We have to recover together, because what we tend to think is that it's my job, but actually it's kind of our job. It's a collective. We store up shame collectively. It's intergenerational, it's cultural, it's political, it's societal, it's familial, it's dynastic. So there's so many elements to it. So my kind of, I suppose my learning is, David, as you know, I do a lot of work with compassion circles. So the question is, how do we hold our shame together, and how can we recover together? And that's it's brave work. It's brave work to visit those parts of ourselves that may have always felt wrong.
Oof, man, I mean, I do a lot of parts work in my emotional integration process, and I've definitely found the parts of me that think some deep level down, I am wrong. There's something wrong with me. And I really interesting distinction, between guilt and shame, where guilt is sort of like that action maybe that I did was wrong, but the shame is, no, I'm somehow wrong on an inside level, and so I have to hide. I can't let that be seen, I can't, because it'll break my familial relations, as you mentioned, it'll break these connections that I need. Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot of what I do in the circles that I hold from you, so I really appreciate that. What you've taught me in the circles, and I would love to hear, how does this process work? This like collective, shame sort of seeing, or what happens in one of these circles when the shame stuff comes up.
Well, one of the realizations that I've made is that, this is kind of, I don't know, hazardous terrain. It's sensitive and it's delicate, and it can be very triggering and reactivating for people. So I've become somebody that's very passionate about rigorous facilitation and structure. So when we work in the circle, there's a fair amount of contracting around equality of airtime, around process. So we integrate presencing with structure, with thinking rounds, with pairs dialogues. We create the conditions where we encourage people to listen with a quiet mind and an open heart. We think very carefully about the focus questions. We consciously use kind of validation and appreciation practices, so there's a sense of being seen and received. It's always fine to pass, so it's really important systemically that if people are not ready, it's always fine to pass. And we really work with 3 flows of compassion. So self-compassion, so compassion from myself for myself. Compassion for others, so compassion from myself for others. And compassion from others for me. So how am I with receiving compassion? How am I with that outflow of compassion? And what is my relationship to my own compassion? And then so the process of rigorous holding over time seems to create sufficiently favorable conditions for trust to emerge and evolve, and for disclosure, and for people to name what it is that they might have. And I don't know whether what's coming up for me now is that I think I've been lucky enough to facilitate probably, 600-700 circles off the top of my head. I've never worked it out, but I've been doing this for about 20 years, and it's been a huge part of my life. And what's coming to mind is people that have been able to, like a woman left an abusive relationship the day after a compassion circle that she'd been in for 15 years. I think 3 people have kind of come out and spoken openly about their sexuality for the first time in compassion circles. So I think circle work, rigorous, compassionately facilitated circle work. I'm going to use this word not in a religious sense, but in a literal sense, can be the work of revelation. So literally revealing parts of ourselves that have perhaps been hidden away, where we can kind of find that sense of fellow feeling and solidarity, and just that kind of sense of common humanity. It's not just me, you know, just like me, you feel wrong. Just like me, you wish to be happy. That kind of sense of moving from self judgment to self kindness. So that conscious invitation into that embodied intent to meet ourselves with kindness, and to remember that our human family suffers, and that we all have this propensity for this feeling of wrongness, and we all have this potential for change and growth, and to find ways to integrate our suffering. But my perspective and my kind of realization is that this is not a destination. It's always a work in progress. You know, it's always, what are we working with? You know, a friend of mine talks about, can we turn the crap to manure? You know, and that's the kind of ground of being. That's the stuff. That's where the fertile ground is. And I mean, my own. I mean, maybe we can open this up a little bit more and all maybe speak a little bit, maybe share from our own perspective. I'm still really going through it. You know, I'm in a battle with depression. I go through periods of my shame reaction gets really triggered. I've got a big imposter syndrome thing going on. You know, I go through periods of wanting to die. It's intense. So this is the work. You know, it's ongoing. It's the work, and the presence of compassion, the direct presence of compassion in my life, in my work, and in my personal life enables me to feel the groundlessness, but be okay with the groundlessness at least some of the time.
Man, there's so much there I want to unpack. But this, it sounds like one of the important things in handling shame is to make what's coming to me as a container. You know, you're talking about this really structured facilitation. It kind of reminds me of, you know, in couples therapy, there's an exercise called the container exercise, where you set a contract about who's going to speak and for how long, and what are appropriate reactions, and how do you hold the space to make it safe. And it allows for this freedom of communication, because it's a very, very clear rules, you know, about how the communication is going to come, so people don't have to feel like they need to defend themselves, or, you know, they're going to be met with some surprise, and it makes it easier. So it sounds like, you know, you're doing that with the structure, you know, on a group level with the structure. And then it sounds like the other thing that helps is these shameful things being seen, which I've had a full experience of that. I mean, a coach friend of mine and I, we used to have this practice where we would get on the phone, and the first things we would say is something we didn't want anybody to know about us. You know, and we tried to do that it was a shame dissolving exercise, because once the thing is seen, it's, you know, the shame somehow loses its power. Once another person sees it and doesn't reject you, you know, the shame loses its power. Yeah. And then the third thing is the compassion part, you know, bringing the compassion to meet the shame and how that helps. So I think it would also be helpful right now to figure out, what is compassion? You know, we have about, you know, 20, 25 more minutes to go through all this, and we can share more our own personal experiences. By the way, I really appreciate you sharing what you're actually going through, because so few people are willing to talk about that. So few people are willing to admit it. So thank you so much for admitting that. And I mean, me too. Just to offer some support. I mean, I have found many parts of myself that are like, why am I here? You know, this, and feeling so depressed that it's like they could just exit. You know, fortunately, I've had the experience that these really painful parts are not the full me. They're not the complete me, and they're not, you know, in one sense, like the real me. And so it's like, how do I hold space for those parts and not push them away, but meet them with my own love, you know? And that for me is what really helps those parts to feel like they're starting to feel okay, instead of being so scared, you know? So I'm just sharing that. I don't know. I'm sharing that. It's coming up for me. It doesn't matter. But why don't we figure out, what's this thing called compassion that we can bring to meet our shame? And I like these 3 directions of compassion you mentioned. What is it really? I mean, there's other words like empathy, sympathy, compassion. Are there differences? How do we want to describe this?
So let's unpack. So empathy is an ability to place oneself in another's shoes, but one can place oneself in another's shoes and then torture them. So empathy is very different to compassion. Empathy kind of has a good name in our culture, but actually it can be used to destroy each other. If we think of it from the kind of shadow side of empathy, I can understand what feelings I can create in another person. I can put myself in their shoes, and that can give rise to all kinds of maladaptive behavior, that ability. But I think so I just want to say before I go any further that I claim no expertise in this space. The longer I inquire, the more I realize how little I know. We're looking here at thousands of years of Buddhist thought and spiritual development, and so I'm really happy to be having the dialogue, but I want to show up with beginner's mind. I love that bit of Zen which says, in the mind of the beginner there are many possibilities, in the mind of the expert there are few. So I'm wanting to open a space within myself in this moment, a space of authentic curiosity with you both and with the viewers. And so probably the most couple of things on compassion for me, a couple of things that have really resonated for me is one, the idea that there are 2 psychologies within compassion. So the first psychology is witnessing. Okay, so it's a mindfulness of suffering in myself or another. So it's like, I see you and I recognize that there is suffering here. Okay, so that's like a seeing, a validation, an honoring, a witnessing. Without the other psychology, it's not compassion. So the other psychology can be thought of as alleviation or some sense of action. So I see your suffering or my own suffering, and I'm moved by it. I'm moved by your predicament. I'm moved by your suffering. And then it gets really complex, because very often there's nothing to do other than to witness the suffering and be moved by it. That's enough. So one of the things that we talk about in the world of end of life care and mental health care that I've been very involved in is, let's say somebody's in the bed and they're aware that they're dying. They don't want your role, they want your soul. They want that presence. They don't necessarily want you to be discharging a whole bunch of tasks and doing the observations and swooping in and swooping out again. They just want to feel like you're really there. So I think the relationship between compassion and presence is, you can feel it. You can feel when somebody's with you, and you can feel when somebody's running a script and they're not really with you, when they're in task mode. And that's not to diminish the amazing work that people do at the bedside that is task oriented. But I know myself, having been through and continue to go through complex mental health challenges and having many mental health professionals in my life, the thing that makes all the difference is when I just feel that depth of presence and that willingness to witness me, be with me, be open, non-judgmental, and then just maybe gently to make 1 or 2 suggestions. I'm wondering about this, I'm wondering about that. So there's a kind of a gentleness, but there's also something quite muscular. His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about muscular compassion. So it's quite fierce. It's not easy. It requires a lot of courage to live a compassionate life and to connect. Because as soon as you go to connect, you take a risk. Because you're like, I'm sensing this, I'm wondering if for myself or another. So that's the first thing, the 2 psychologies I wanted to mention. And then the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is the 4 faces of compassion. So there are many different understandings from different schools, but the one that's resonated me and helped me back to shame to work most directly with my shame. And just to say, there's a letter to shame online. So if people wanted to look it up, just Google Andy Bradley letter to shame. I think David has shared that with you recently. And I worked very directly with these 4 faces of compassion. So just very briefly, I can slow myself down. I might not be very brief. So the first face of compassion is patience. So what that's been like for me as a man with a whole bunch of stuff to work through is this is going to take a while, Andy, and that's okay. It's no rush. Settle in. So patience is the first face of compassion. And again, at the bedside, it's okay, I'm here, I'm not rushing off. It's okay, I know you're not quite ready yet to make that decision or whatever it might be. So patience is the first face of compassion. And then it was the patience that enabled me to, well, it's very much work in progress because I still find myself intolerable at times, but the second face of compassion is tolerance. So that's an invitation to, it's like an engineering term, isn't it, tolerance? It's like how much tolerance is there between those moving parts? And to what degree can I tolerate the wrongness, the shame, the parts of myself I tend to reject? Or to what degree can I tolerate a life of joy and happiness and release and freedom? And so that gave me a compass for a lot of my feelings, that sense of, a patient invitation to become a more tolerant individual. And that's, that's philosophical, it's practical, it's psychological, it's sociological. How am I with tolerating other worldviews? How am I tolerating the things that trigger me? So there's lots of levels to that. So that's the second face. And then the third face of compassion is forgiveness. So I've settled in, I'm learning to tolerate myself, and I can feel a lot of emotion rising as I get into this one, because this is very deep. Am I ready to forgive myself? Am I ready to forgive the things that have created the shame? Am I ready to be a kind of a source of forgiveness internally and externally? Forgive, it's a gift for you, for me. It's such a gift, forgiveness. And it's complex. Again, it's complex. So none of these things are offered with any sort of sense of simplicity or force, because if it was easy to do these things, we'd all be doing them already, and we'd all be, cracking on. So that's the third face. So patience, tolerance, forgiveness. And then the fourth face of compassion is love. So how ready am I to love myself and the world around me? And my continuing challenge is I'm more ready to love the world around me than I am to love the world within me. And so that self-to-self compassion that I spoke about, for me, is that is my work. And David, we had a wonderful, I don't know how long it was, 18 months or something together, and it was a fantastic experience of learning from you and working with you. And we did the New Story of Care events, and we did a whole bunch of stuff, and it was great. It was a lot of fun. But I would say systemically what's changed for me since that time is my awareness of the central integral nature of self-compassion to this inquiry has deepened. So it might have been, the work systemically might have been, come on, you lot, take better care of yourselves so you can care for the patients, but not enough depth into how elusive that is. And as a pattern, coaches, psychologists, nurses, doctors, we're more comfortable with caring for other people than we are with caring for ourselves. That's why we're doing it, generally speaking. Therapists, often have a bunch of their own stuff they've not yet dealt with. So yeah, that's those are the two psychologies and the four faces, and where there's a lot of content. I hope that's okay.
I really like what you said about caring for others is easier than caring for ourselves, and it reminded me of my experience with metta meditation or loving kindness meditation, because one thing to approach it is to start by, you need to start by someone that you love unconditionally. And some instruction says that you should start by yourself and then start by continue with someone else. But for me, it was always easier, and for many people I facilitated with, always easier to start with the dog, or with, really often with the dog, actually, because it's so easy to love this other creature, and it's so cute all the time. And then I found it, and many people found it easier to bring this love to ourselves rather than start from our self-love, which in many cases requires some work in order to be nurtured, this self-love, so that it can grow. And I completely agree with what you say, that all the coaches I talk to, all the people who came into activities where they help each other, and I include myself in that, obviously, there is always this part of, it's easier to help someone else than to look at what's really inside your shame and your own bag of shit, excuse my French, and deal with it, you know. So yeah, I really relate to what you just shared. Thank you.
Well, the thing about the dog is that the love is unconditional, right? And the thing about the self is that love is conditional. So my love for myself continues to be contingent on certain conditions. Whereas the love that I feel from Rusty, the dog, which David's met Rusty, the love that I continue to feel for Rusty and from Rusty is unconditional, which is why dogs are often an object of meditation. So one of the things that David, I think we were playing in this space when we were working together was I was really, really depressed and, you know, suicidal up on the South Downs in Brighton. And I was out with Rusty, the dog. He's a Cocker Spaniel. He's 14 now. And I was really in trouble mentally. I was really in a lot of difficulty. So I looked down at Rusty and I actually said these words. I said, mate, I'm really struggling here. I don't know if I can carry on. So guess what he did? He kind of looked up at me and then kind of wagged his tail. And then I had the thought, be the dog you are. and then I had the thought, do what makes your tail wag. And then I really observed Rusty, and, you know, again, beginner's mind, work in progress. Trust me, I'm still really going through it, but it's great to reconnect with this Rusty wisdom, because Rusty's either got his tail on the go and he's really kind of happy, or he's even more excited where he's going for a treat, or he's resting in the sunshine. He's just gone splat. So actually, you know, a lot of what we need to learn as human beings, we can learn directly from the non-human world, and the world of what Einstein called nature and all of its beauty. You know, that is such a teacher if we can take ourselves into wild places and really connect with our spirit animals, our dogs, our owls, our cats, our red kites, all of these creatures. They're just on it. They just know how to be. And us kind of domesticated primates, we're all kind of shuffling about, trying to make sense of the world. So be the dog you are. So if you get nothing else from this call, be the dog you are, whatever that is, because this is not a rehearsal.
Do what makes your tail wag. Yeah, I remember when you told me about that. You know, but the thing is that, you know, the reason you were able to connect with that in that moment is because one of the reasons is because you are someone who has very practiced your presence. You know, you do meditation very regularly, you know, for years. You've practiced your mindfulness. So, and you mentioned that presence, you know, part of that is part of that compassion, that witnessing component, you know. So this to me is just another story about how meditation, which builds that presence muscle, that muscle to be in the present moment, is so helpful for our emotional and mental health, because you're in a really down spot, you're having a really rough moment, and because we have that, we've started to build that presence muscle. We first we realize it in ourselves, and we have the presence. You had the presence to take a pause and notice what was going on with you, and actually say it out loud, you know, without doing anything dangerous. You know, you didn't take action on it. You know what I mean? You had the presence to pause and feel it within you, and you had a space between feeling it and taking action. You know, and you decided in that moment to speak, and then you had the presence to stay with Rusty, you know, who's there beaming unconditional love, and you got these thoughts came. So, you know, that was a self-compassion moment. That was a witnessing, and then that was a witnessing followed by you were moved to do something which was communicated to Rusty, you know. And in that, I really like what you said, that the movement part of compassion, the action part of compassion, it sometimes can get complicated to understand what that is. You know, if someone's on the street, you know, having a really rough time, we walk past a homeless person, you know, what is the compassion thing in that moment, you know, and how do we address, what's the compassionate way to address that on a bigger scale? And it can feel messy and it can feel difficult. But in that moment, you had the presence, you had the witness of the pain inside of you, and then you did a compassionate action, which was just to express it, get it out, say it out loud. In my view, that's one way I'm seeing that situation, So I think that just speaks so well for me to how meditation and compassion go together.
So, thank you both for your reflections. I want to just not push back, but I want to just unpack a little bit the potential for mindfulness to be a kind of spiritual bypassing. I guess this is something you've probably talked about before. So I think there's a lot of people in the West who've been practicing quietening their mind and following their breath. Maybe it's doing the body scan or mindful walking. But if there's not a spiritual foundation or a spiritual practice contained within, then the heart can actually get even more disconnected from the mind. And that can cause a lot of confusion, because people might have a mindfulness practice, but they might not know how to engage with the suffering within them and around them. And actually, I feel like I've been through that stage, and it was quite a long stage where I'd get up and meditate, I'd get up and quieten my mind, but there was something not connecting. I wasn't dealing with this shame, and I wasn't. Does that make sense? I was somehow disconnected. It was like a method. It was a method rather than a practice, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pick up on that and then maybe build on that to say, okay, so, maybe the mindfulness practitioner notices the street homeless person and maybe sends them a blessing and moves on. But maybe the compassionate activist, and this is something that I'm kind of unpacking there's an amazing organization called the Heart Movement. And we're building a kind of podcast series about what what is compassionate activism. So we're kind of going to be unpacking that, and it feels really good to be thinking about connecting this conversation with that conversation. And so, David, I don't think we ever did the compassion experiment. So we just did an experiment. So in a city, so we'll gather in London, we'll spend some time in a circle, and then I just send people out in threes into London to do the compassion experiment. And their only brief is to just go and be compassionate. That's it. And they've got half an hour, and then to come back and then report back. And what I've learned is about 80% of people go to the first sort of mini supermarket they can find. No, they go and find someone nowhere to live. That's the first thing they do. Then they go and find somewhere, some food and some drink. And they buy them some food and drink. And then they give it to that person. They wish them a good day. And they come back. And that's the form that compassion takes for many of us. And then, creating a safe space and not wanting people to feel criticized in any way, shape or form. How many of you found out the person's name? How many of the people that you met now know your name? How many people were asked what they need? They might have had 4 sandwiches in the last 15 minutes. So compassionate activism for me is fundamentally, and this is what compassion is about, it's about a very simple question, which is, what do you need? And it's having the courage to ask that question. Hello, mate. I've only got 5 minutes. My name's Andy. Shake hands. If you've got 5 minutes, what do you need? I mean, I remember a guy I met outside Lidl near where I lived, and he just came straight out with it. He said, I need a new saucepan. Because the handle had broken on his saucepan, and he was wild camping. And in Aldi, they had saucepans for £4. I could afford that. So it was a very direct, I was able to meet that man's need. I've never met him again. And I'm not like saying this to blow my own trumpet. I'm just trying to unpack the difference between maybe mindfulness, compassionate activism, that kind of that movement to action. And it's not about saying, you're continually scanning for suffering, because I myself, as I said earlier, I'm much more comfortable with the outward compassion than I am with the inward compassion. So it's a trap for me. It's a bit of an addiction. I'll even go out and find someone to help, and that's quite dysfunctional. I'm like a helpaholic, because I'm like bonded to that feeling I get when I get the saucepan or whatever it might be. So, probably more to unpack than we've got time to think about now. But what I'm realizing is I have to get my own house in order. It really does begin with me, because otherwise it's not quite I'm not quite walking the talk. It's another kind of talk that it's not integrated. It's rescuing, or it's something else. It feels compassionate in the moment, and it's grounded in that question of, but systemically speaking, if I'm asking all these other folks what they need, and I'm not asking myself that question deeply enough, it's probably still coming out of an ungrounded kind of awareness.
Oh my gosh, this is. I mean, we only have a few more minutes, but I mean, this is, I can feel the compassion like coming off of you. I can feel it. I mean, the whole Arno and I have just been staring like in presence. I mean, you've kind of called us into a different place in our awareness, and I don't, so, I want to say this for you and all the coaches, therapists, teachers out there who are struggling with that imposter syndrome, feeling like, how can I teach when I'm still working on myself so much, And I would say that the parts that you're working on are not all you. There's also other parts that are right now sitting in love and awareness, and you can bring those into other people, even if you still have so many traumas you're working on, and I feel like you are doing that, Andy. I mean, the level of awareness you have for yourself is incredible. Your willingness to just blow through shame and share what you're feeling is incredible and inspiring, and I think if more people did that, so much tension and trauma would drop from the world, or at least be available to be worked with, so that it can drop from the world, be released and integrated. And I don't want you to stop, teaching this. I mean, I feel like, just hearing you speak about this, how you're so articulate about it is this needs to be out there more. This needs to be out there more. And I, for all of you who are speaking from your heart and really working on yourself, it's really true that the thing we sometimes need to learn the most and the deepest because of our life circumstances is the thing we're here to teach, because you know it so well, because you've been through it, that you can teach it. So, I mean, thank you, Andy, for diving in so deep into yourself so you can bring this out for us.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I completely agree, and that's one of the things that bring me a lot of joy when I think back about my business, Peaceful Creativity, and every time the imposter syndrome comes to me, I'm like, what? But wait a minute, that's what I still want to learn, and that's actually great that I want to teach what I'm still learning, because it means that I care about it, that I want to go deeper about it, And I think that we are all in this for the same reason. We want to help others because we want to help ourselves, and we are passionate about that. So I think the imposter syndrome is just a natural thing that happen that needs to be observed, and then, continue your way through that. I love the term of helpaholic or helpaholic. I've never heard it before, and this is great to have a name to this. And just as David said, I was really impressed by your awareness when you actually know that sometimes you go a little bit overboard, and you try to find help for yourself by helping kind of almost compulsively other outside and giving them saucepan. This is an amazing awareness, and thank you again for being so open about all of this, and spreading compassion all around. This is very, very amazing what you're doing, Andy.
How much time do we have? Are we out of time? I just wanted to say one more thing if I can.
Yeah, please.
Sure.
So I wanted to point people towards, because I'm aware that people might watch the recording of this conversation, so I wanted to point people towards 10-minute pause space. Pause as in PAUSE, which has just been adopted by the National Health Service as a response to COVID-19. So it's like a distillation of compassion circles, and it's a 10-minute circle that people can go into in the emergency zone and just have some practice and go around a bit of time with a partner. And it finishes with the statement, to be kind, wise and compassionate towards myself, I will. So 10-minute pause space. If you look online, maybe you guys could connect your network to it. That would be really great. I'd really appreciate it.
Pause circles.
And
They can search for it. We can search for it like this.
10-minute pause space.
10-minute pause space. Okay.
I'll send you a link. And then the other thing was just two very quick pieces of poetry, if I may. One
Yes.
from both quite quick, but both in preparing for our dialogue came up. So the first one is called Clearing, and it's by Martha Postlethwaite. Do not try to save the whole world or to do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world so worthy of rescue. And then the shortest, but for me most beautiful Rumi poem. So Rumi, a Sufi mystic from the 13th century. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there.
I love that one too. I love that one. Thank you. You know, I was journaling just this morning, and I realized one of the things I'm trying to do is kind of like out-action the universe, like outdo the universe, like push so much with my actions. I'm somehow trying to move faster than the universe, and I realized like the universe is doing so much. There's no way I can out-action the universe. So how about I just take a breath and let some things happen and find where my moment of harmony is, you know? So it reminded me of that. I really thank you for those poems, man. This is our first poems on the show. I love those.
Yeah, I was thinking that first time. It sounds great.
So
Yeah,
we just have a couple minutes.
My encouragement is to in-action the universe rather than out-action the universe. Yeah. Drop in. So I just want to, I just want to thank you both for what you're doing and the space you're holding and your energy and your connection you have with each other. As kind of humble, beautiful men, I just massively appreciate the kind of alignment that you've built with each other, the peace, the creativity, the love, the revolution, the energy. It's very deep and profound what you're doing for us. So thank you both very much, and thank you for your warmth and generosity and inviting me into your space. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
This was an amazing conversation. I mean, a lot to think about, and on our own shame, our own compassion. You know, you mentioned, maybe we can just end on this. You mentioned your personal practice that you encourage, your starting place for everybody, the quiet mind, open heart. And I'm just wondering if there's just a couple minutes, you know, a minute version of you being able to share with people how they can take a step toward this quiet mind, open heart, which gives them access to these compassionate resources inside themselves.
As much as I would like to attend this, and I have another meeting in 10 minutes that I need to set up, so I'm going to leave the meeting right now. But please, Andy, do share this, because this way I can rewatch the recording and use it as well. But I really need to leave, guys. So I'm feeling a little bit of shame saying that, but I'm giving myself compassion and moving despite that. Thank you, Andy, and David. We talk later, and thank you for all the words.
Let's say goodbye to Arno, everybody. Bye, Arno.
Bye. Goodbye. See ya.
So, so how can we get started, Andy, with the quiet mind, open heart? What would be your recommendation?
So I think I think if people that view this conversation felt like they felt drawn to the quiet mind, open heart practice, then I think the TED Talk is a really great place to expand what we can do right now. So there's a 10-minute talk. If you Google Andy Bradley Closing the Compassion Gap, and I kind of unpack the stories that created the practice. David, where I am right now in terms of what's happening with COVID-19, how much complexity there is, and distress, the lockdown, the kind of war footing, the people not getting to touch and hug, and, grandparents not getting to take their grandchild's hand, or it's very profound what we're living through.
Yeah.
So where I am right now, I guess, with my own meditation practice is to hold it very lightly. And it's really as simple as, here I am, feet on the ground. I realize that I'm breathing. I notice that I'm not alone. And as I connect with that contact point, with the soles of my feet on the ground, and I realize that I'm breathing, I very gently, with no force, invite my mind to quieten.
Okay.
So here I am, I'm breathing, I'm inviting my mind to quieten, and now I'm getting curious about the state of my heart. So I'm gently inviting my mind to quieten, and I'm getting curious about the possibility that my heart might open. But it's very, very gentle. There's no force, there's no requirement, there's no attachment. It's just a space. And then on a practical level, if people wanted to become more directly curious about the quiet mind, open heart practice, I'd really encourage people to do just a begin. I don't mean beginner as in, I mean a great place to begin is to go and buy yourself a new journal, or get one of those journals out of the drawers that you really love. And then what I would advocate is that you just put a timer on for 5 minutes. You do your feet on the ground, your quiet mind, open heart. You just sit and have that intention to quieten your mind and open your heart. And then your timer goes off. You open your journal. You write the date. You write the words, here I am. And then you just write for 5 minutes, whatever comes out. So it's a 10-minute practice. So it begins with coming into that embodiment, and then here I am, and then just whatever comes up. So that's a 10-minute begin.
That sounds great. That sounds great, and something easy people can implement. I like how you described it as gentle. Here I am, feet on the ground, and I'm not alone. I really like that. And then I'm inviting my mind to quiet. I'm getting curious about what's in my heart, and just holding that for 5 minutes, and then picking up the paper and saying, here I am, and writing whatever comes for 5 minutes. Did I get it? Yeah, that sounds like a beautiful practice. I know that, journaling like that, free journaling, has brought me tons of insights about myself, and I think after a moment of presence like that, or 5 minutes of presence like that, people can get some really nice insights. Yeah. Oh man, Andy, this is great talking to you. It's great seeing you again. It's been a long time since we talked, since those 18 months or so when I was in the UK. So it was great connecting with you. Everybody, if you want to find out more about Andy's work, go to frameworksforchange.co.uk. You can do that, search for the 10-minute pause space, and find his TED Talk, Andy Bradley TEDx online. What's the title of your TED Talk? Just so they can...
Closing the compassion gap.
Closing the compassion gap. So you can find that.
And then the letter to shame is Dear Shame, Andy Bradley. You'll find it there. So if people, and my in a way, I guess my kind of final encouragement is write a letter to shame. It's a really interesting. You could do that practice and then just write Dear Shame or Dear Joy or Dear Grief and just see what comes out. I
really like that because it's kind of it's not just addressing the thing you're shameful about, but addressing the feeling itself. And that's a very interesting perspective to take. You'll get a different set of insights that way. Yeah. Well, thanks, Andy. This was a fantastic show. I really hope people go find you and connect with you, and start practicing this, quiet mind, open heart. Which can, this is the kind of thing that we need right now in this crazy time. To center, get more rooted in ourselves, and center back in ourselves, and center back in our heart. I mean, I feel like our hearts are what are going to carry us through this to a better place if we can stay there, So thank you so much for all that you're doing. You're very welcome. Thanks, David. You go well. You too. All right, everybody. I'm going to hit the outro. Until next time, see you on our next episode of PeaCreaLive.